CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Prof Moyo. I'm actually so excited to have this conversation with Professor Karuti Kanyinga. We are doing this at the margins of our MasterCard Foundation funded project that looks into the contributions of the non-profit sector towards dignified and fulfilling jobs. And we are doing this straight from Mombasa at the Marina Hotel, English Point. Prof, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for making the time. I know this is a busy time for you, for everyone around here, but for you most importantly, you have been a research professor for development studies at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. And as we were working here, I was asking you, how long have you been at the Institute? And you said since 1991. That makes it 34 years.
Yes.
Let's reflect on your journey so far. Where Prof Karuti Kanyinga is at the moment. What's your state of mind? What is it that you are reflecting back and looking back and saying, over the last 34 years, these are the things that remain memorable to you?
Over the last four decades, if I can say that, in the last 4 years or so, one thing that sticks in my mind is how politics of development have kept on changing within African societies.
Right.
In the 1990s, what is the most memorable period is the structural adjustment program that the IMF and the World Bank implemented across Africa, forced quite a number of African countries to adopt them on understanding that this will change the economies and make the economic performance improve. But to the contrary, what happened with the structural adjustment program is that many countries actually became worse. Zimbabwe, unemployment was on increase. Kenya, unemployment was on increase. Poverty levels deepened during the period. Health care crisis, access to basic services, education. That's the most remarkable period I remember in the 1990s. And the reason for that is simply because the World Bank and IMF and a similar program for everyone. Whether you had malaria, when you have malaria, you are given quinine.
Yeah.
But now, this time, even if you are coughing, you would get quinine. If you're having a tummy problem, everybody was getting the same kind of package. And that told us very clearly that context in development matters. You can never generalize development policies or generalize on development interventions with everyone. A context-specific intervention is what is required. That's the most important thing to remember. Tied to this, what I've seen over the years is the increasing contradictions on the role of the state in development. And what I'm calling the contradictions in the role of the state in development comprises a number of things. On the one hand, we are in the 1990s, where people, where a majority of scholars and scholars, especially inspired by Western tradition, began to question the relevance of the state because of its unresponsive behavior. But at the same time, African scholars would argue the state is the way it was simply because it is still captured by Western interest and it doesn't live to follow Africa's aspirations. And what many African scholars were calling then for is not reforming of the economies of the African societies, but reforming the state. And that's actually what led to the second wave of constitution making across the continent. On the argument that actually if you make a constitution much more relevant and lean to reformation of the state, that is going to make the state much more responsive. Unfortunately, the wave of constitutional reforms across Africa did not produce the kind of responsive states that we would have admired to have, for simple reason that most of the constitutional making processes were imposed from above. Very few countries, if any, under constitution making process from below. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because we know very well that constitution making from below has got certain consequences. It has very revolutionary tendencies, and it tends to wash away all the signs of oppression, exploitation, and creates new institutions. Unfortunately, constitution making from above that witnessed in 1990s and early 2000 period was from above and elite dominated. That's the second thing I would like to mention. The third thing to mention is increasing role of civil society and the non-profit sector in general. When the state started retreating from the development space, it is the non-government organizations or civil society, philanthropic and voluntary organizations that filled that particular gap that was emerging in service delivery. But instead of the state building capacities or having enabling policies to support non-government organizations and their role in development, the tendency in a majority of African countries, except in South Africa, was actually to stifle the operations of civil society. And that's the major contradiction again. So we have also got new contradictions now. The first contradiction emerging from how the state was being viewed by African scholars and Western scholars, and the tension that was creating on the development space, and now the new role of civil society and their role, and that role not being appreciated wholly by African governments. But I must add here that African communities, the African society, became increasingly appreciative of the role of non-governmental organizations across the continent. In fact, even faith-based organizations, religious organizations, started venturing into development work in order to support those people who were in need of support at that particular time. The third thing I would like to say, and this is what I would end up with, is the growing role of religion, but with negative identities. Whereas religion in the old days was seen as a religion that plays a role in society, providing spiritual opportunities, providing spiritual guidance. What we have seen over the years now is religion actually with a negative identity for the first time. We have seen rise of religious movements that are highly exploitative of the poor in society. And this is the prosperity gospel. And in every country of Africa you go to, churches are more than schools in some places. On Sundays, it's like everyone now is going to church to do ABCD. But prosperity gospel has got one major shortcoming. It is undermining the potential to transform the society, because on one hand it tells people that you'll get everything from heaven. But it doesn't tell people that actually you must work hard to go to heaven.
It requires hard work to get there.
And two, the pastors of modern day are interested in exploiting the poor, and especially making the poor extremely vulnerable. The more poor you are and malleable you are, the more the pastors are getting into your lives. We know pastors in South Africa, in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, who are literally stealing from their congregation and exploiting the poor. And yet, across Africa, religious institutions are not taxed. And we have not seen any government that comes very strong and hard on this new menace that is actually corrupting the morals and weakening the foundation on which the society is given rise. So those are the key features, what I can say are features of my scholarship in the last 34 years. I should even end, if I can add another feature here.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Two things also. Demographic dividends, demographic or youth bulge, and technology. Those are two things that have been very emergent, and I would like to speak to them very briefly.
Sure.
I do not subscribe to the view that Africa's got a youth dividend. I do not subscribe to the view that Africa's future is on their youth, because in a few years' time, African youth will be the only, Africa will be the only continent with youth that will be able to work, or will be able in will be able to participate in economic development.
Yeah.
I have my misgivings on that, because the youth we are talking about is youth that is not getting access to education.
Right.
Is the youth that Human Development Per Capita Index is very poor on, because the governments do not have money to build the capacity of our youth.
Yeah.
We do not have money. Governments in Africa are not spending resources to build the skills for these youth.
Yeah.
So even if the youth becomes, even if Africa's got a very huge number of youth, unemployed youth, and the youth that everyone is looking at, this is the youth that is not going to be very equipped
not
to
fit for
participate.
purpose. Not fit
they
for
are not
purpose,
fit for
yeah.
purpose.
Yeah.
And this is what we should be spending our resources on, getting government to get money into education and relevant skills, so that the youth can play a good role. In fact, that's a major cause of unemployment across Africa today. Because our workforce, whether we look at youth in South Africa, whether we look at youth in Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Liberia, name it, are youth who are disillusioned with the type of first of all, with the fact that the government is not building industrial potential for their countries so that they can get jobs. But most importantly, education has become very expensive for our youth to get the relevant skills they require. So we are actually in a serious crisis as a continent as we move into the future. And I would like us to disabuse this particular feeling that we have got an advantage of having a youth bulge. No, it's not an advantage until we give them the skills that are required. Let me end up by mentioning technology.
Which is also, in many ways, one of the issues that is used to argue that Africa is sitting at an advantageous position because of the big numbers of the young people, but also the fact that young people are so easily, they can easily use technology in such ways that the older generation cannot. And so let's talk to the issue of technology, but if possible, also link it to this question of the youth bulge and the perceived advantage that we have.
We are a continent that is experiencing technology revolution like any other part of the world. Technology revolution in the sense that mobile phone today, penetration in Africa is very high in some countries. In places like Kenya, mobile phone technology as penetration is very high. Same with other countries. Same with other countries like Ghana, South Africa. To a large extent, when we can say that technology, and more so mobile phone technology, is the way to go. Two, we are talking about a majority of the youth, those who are about below 30 years of age, were born during the cell phone era, during the time when technology and computers have become of age. But how many governments in Africa are incentivizing use of technology in a positive manner? How many governments in Africa are picking the social media space and saying that this is what we want to exploit for our for our country? I'm mentioning this because it's as if the governments are coming with a very late intervention in technology, and instead of looking for ways and means of building the technology capacity of their countries, most of them are actually coming with very retrogressive measures. I'll take, for instance, Uganda. Technology plays a very important role in the election campaigns, but every time there is an election campaign in Uganda, the government closes down on that particular space. We have got the Western governments that have got a lot of hackers around. Russia is cited as hacking this and that. But what have we done to leverage on our technology competencies that we have today? I don't think we do well. The second thing is that we sometimes tend to tax technology equipments
Yeah.
as a source of revenue for government, rather than looking at it as something that is going to be utilized for use by the youth.
Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
yet to see an African country that says that computer importation is tax-free now.
Tax-free, yeah. Yeah. So, Prof, the other thing
So we have got a problem in
Yeah.
how the government actually
Right.
creates enabling
Yeah.
environment
Environments, yeah.
for our future, for investment by the
Yeah.
youth.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, sticking with the question of the youth, and I would want to come back to some of your research interests and the work that you have done. But we are here actually partly because of this question of the young people.
Yes.
And the project that we are implementing jointly with you and many others across 17 countries is actually focusing on the contributions of the non-profit sector towards creating, decent jobs, and fulfilling, dignified jobs. But you and several others, many years back in the early 2000s, were actually involved in studies that were trying to understand the contributions of the non-profit sector towards Africa's economy. And in this case, we're looking at Kenya and maybe other several East African countries. And here we are 20-something years later, trying to look at the same phenomenon and now updating it and looking at other countries. But I would want us to maybe use the benefit of your wisdom to talk about what was then when you did the John Hopkins study for Kenya and I think other East African countries, and what is happening today. So what were the findings then that you can speak to, and what we still see happening today?
At the time we were doing the study, one thing which was very remarkable in all the countries where we did the studies is phenomenal growth of non-profit sector across the continent. In many countries, we can say it was dense associational life that you could see. Mushrooming of organizations that are geared towards community development, service activities, advocacy work in very, very, very big ways. The second thing that was very clear at that particular time was increasing interest in government, by government, to create an enabling environment through policies for non-profit organizations. But here must come with a caveat. Governments were much more interested in creating an enabling environment for developmental non-governmental organizations. But at the same time interested in crippling the wings or stifling operations of advocacy organizations, and especially those who are interested in governance and human rights activities. And I'm mentioning that simply because we usually say that sustainable development is development that is designed with a human rights element, right? A human rights-based approach where there is participation, enabling communities to participate, and non-discriminatory elements. And the moment the government started stifling the activities of human rights organizations, then we can say even the engagement in developmental space and NGOs did not really go very well. Related to that, at that time also there was emergence of youth organizations across Africa. Youth seeking voice and forming different associations to give them voice in policy spaces, to be heard, if one can say that. They wanted voice to be heard across policy circles. They wanted their voice to be heard by decision makers everywhere. That was then. And then the most important thing is at the time, actually we realized non-profit sector was, in terms of employment opportunities, was employing more than
some of the
manufacturing sector. In fact, we would say that almost it had the same, almost half the number of people employed by the public sector. But most important is that the non-profit sector was not visible in government records, was completely invisible in government circles and policymakers. And it's as a result of those studies that governments started paying attention to the non-profit sector. What is different today is the fact that non-profit sector is very visible. Government realized that non-profit sector plays an important role in development. And now that we are talking about youth unemployment across the continent, and especially in a country like Kenya, the non-profit sector organizations, if they have unit of purpose, will be heard more by government. Now, the only problem is that the non-profit sector sometimes do not have unit of purpose to push for an agenda that would help the government see them uniformly or see them in a very positive light and attend to their needs. The second thing that is very common, especially at present and even at that particular time, is the fact that the development partners are more inclined to work with non-profit sector organizations without any questions and without any doubts, and they are very comfortable bedfellows, than the governments are.
Yeah.
And that really surprises some of us. Why would the development partners be the ones who are seeking support to work with the non-governmental organizations when government departments are not doing so? This is the high time to ask governments across the continent to start recognizing the value addition of non-government organizations, and especially because they are found at the base of the society where the poor live. They are found at the base of society where we need employment for the youth. They are found working with every person and in every sector of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, talking of which, I want to link it to what you said earlier about what was happening then, where government was, almost closing the space for organizations that seemed to be advocacy oriented, human rights oriented, and say that I think you still see some of that now, especially with groups that are probably, maybe we've even expanded the realm of which organizations does government see as political. So even groups that are working on accountability issues are now seen in that light. Recently here in Kenya, young people were asking government to account for one of what seemed to be a genuine issue about the finance bill, and the result is the protest and the Gen Z question that we've come to know about. And obviously for some of us who are sitting and studying the situation, this is a continuation of what all governments actually do to close the space for those that are asking critical questions, which is a necessary part of democracy. So I want us to talk and link this to some of your scholarship, which is your work around governance, democracy, citizen participation, and what your analysis is regarding the recent events in Kenya, and what are the implications for other countries as well.
Let me begin by saying that demand for accountability of governments and responsiveness of government is not unique in Kenya alone. In fact, when the protests in Kenya began, many people are saying that sub-Saharan Africa now is waiting their own Arab Spring of some kind. Right? But what many people forget is that states behave the same way everywhere. Political elites in Africa today behave the same everywhere. And because political elites in Africa have a challenge of accountability, even the states that they lead, they themselves are not open to accountability. So that's the first reading. The second reading is that where there is weak rule of law, expect institutions to be weakened and increasingly weakened. And that's how we have got to look at the Kenyan context itself and say that when the Gen Z protest began, genuine as they were, not all government institutions viewed them as relevant and necessary. And simply because political elites want to have their gain. Political elites would not like disruption of status quo. So if the political elites don't want disruption of status quo, the first thing they do is to use the traditional methods of dealing with protests. And where else do people learn those methods other than from South Africa during the apartheid period? Three things you do with social movements. You co-opt them. If you don't co-opt them, you repress them. And if you don't repress them, you get into their leadership. Right? So we see that particular tendency across in Kenya. We see that tendency in different other countries, including Nigeria. So repression becomes a way of gagging the people in protest. But that also sets a very dangerous signal for government, because it means that the youth and their voice has not been addressed. So they turn to now technology, use of technology, and start gaining much more consciousness and talking even much more radically about what they think need to be done and what kind of society they want. But let me also say this. Even if the protest did not end with a lot of gains for them, there is something substantive that has taken place in Kenyan society. It's not business as usual anymore. Everyone knows that actually you need to be very open and you need to be very transparent. Although political elites are yet to learn on this. But a joke that many people are making in Kenya is that senior government officials used to drive their vehicles with sirens, right? And they're driving opposite side of the road. But the Gen Z protest, he told them, you cannot have our money and start behaving on the roads. So we haven't seen them doing that anymore, right? And they were saying that you cannot have our taxes and behave with opulence, use our taxes with opulence. Again, we have seen a reduction of that, right? So there is some behavior that has been behavioral change that we are seeing, but it's not radical enough to say that it's sustainable. Are the gains by Gen Z going to be sustained? I would say that they may not be sustained, but there is a major lesson learned even by political elites. It's not business as usual for them. And I am sure that as we go for the next general election in 2027, the Gen Z and the Kenyans are very conscious that the type of leaders they want are leaders who would behave with responsibility. And I think that's a major lesson learned. So all is not lost, because Kenyans now are discussing very openly, what do we need to improve accountability in public sector? What do we need to have a public sector that is responsive? And most important, remember, Gen Z was saying, we have gone to school, we have got technology, we have got knowledge, but to get a job, you need to know someone. We want systems that work for everyone. We want job opportunities to be extended to everyone, irrespective of who you know in society. And those messages have been sent very loud and clear. And we believe, some of us believe, it's not business as usual.
I mean, of course, hearing from you, I'm drawn to maybe saying, let's spend a few minutes talking about some of your seminal works. So one of the areas that you have worked on is ethnicity and development. So we can take that strand, but I would also be very keen to hear another strand, which is development and devolution, which is another strand that we have done. And then finally, which is linked to what you were saying, your work around, public reforms, law, order, justice, which is also another area of work that you have worked on. Maybe we can start with the reforms, the law and order, because it's very much linked to what you have just said. And then we can go backwards to devolution and development.
Let me begin with the public sector reforms and law and order reforms. And the reason why I think it's very important is because a country requires to be governed by rule of law. And the rule of law is actually the foundation feature of institutions, because it means adherence to set rules and principles, and it means that everyone is guided by certain principles. It's just like also saying that constitutionalism is important, that you have a constitution and you must adhere to what the constitution says. Unfortunately, if you have got a weak rule of law, it means that you are likely to have personality cult or personalization of institutions, where people now govern on basis of where they stand in the office, but not the authority of the authority of the office, but not the authority of the law. That's the most important thing. The second thing is that for public sector institutions in Africa really to reform, even if there is rule of law, for public sector institutions to move and become responsive in society, we need significant public sector reforms. And public sector reforms that are geared towards a number of things. Improving efficiency in public sector to ensure that public sector institutions are efficient in what they deliver. We need public sector reforms that will address the question of corruption, because even if we say there is corruption in every country, we must know very carefully that actually that corruption sits in public sector. It's not the entire society. It's the way public officials abuse the office and use the office for private gain. That's where the problem is. So we need to start asking ourselves, what is it that needs to be done to minimize corruption?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I believe this is where technology comes in again. Digitalization of government services will increase access to those services, will mean that the poor get services from where they are instead of using money to go far away and get those particular services, and so on. So efficiency is improved in that manner, and one becomes also effective. But talking about corruption, let me just digress and give a very interesting phenomena about corruption in public services and how it emerges in many instances.
Yeah.
The kind of corruption that we should be concerned about in Africa is corruption that makes the poor person not get services.
Right.
When the public sector is not providing services, it causes queue jumpers.
Yeah.
It causes a queue, and everybody would like to jump a queue.
Right.
I have seen in the past patients bribing nurses so that nurses can
attend to them first.
Can give them a quick attention and jump them on the queue for surgery.
Yeah.
Because there isn't enough surgical wards, maybe, or maybe the doctors are few. So you bribe your way on that to be attended to. Earlier than the others who are suffering. You know, that's what we are saying, that poor delivery of services actually has got a lot of consequences for the ordinary people and especially the poor. The other thing that public service reforms should focus on is the wage bill across Africa. We look at public sector institutions as a place for dumping everyone, as a place for employment without asking what business is this employment going to be. I'm not talking about restructuring as such, but we need to start asking, how do we match competencies with what is being delivered in public service? Because we have got inefficient delivery of services, we have got corruption, which is on the rise, and yet the ordinary people require services across the board. But even as we think about public sector reforms, it is important to bear in mind the need for sector-wide approach so that you do not reform one institution and leave other institutions hanging. I've noticed in South Africa, West Africa, East Africa, reforms with the police suffer the consequences of the fact that when you reform the police and you fail to reform the judiciary, you fail to reform the prisons, you fail to reform the entire criminal justice system, you end up with the same story as you had before, which becomes very, very problematic in how we deal with issues. So let me jump then to the second issue.
Which is the development of devolution. And I'm aware of the time constraints. But I just want to make sure that we don't leave without talking about devolution and ethnicity.
Let me very quickly talk about devolution and the development in Kenya and say that actually devolution was brought about under our constitution in order to address imbalances in development and right historical wrongs of access to basic services by many people, to ensure that local government, or what we can call subnational units, delivers development in every part of the country without discrimination. And our local governments, our county governments have borrowed extensively from Southern African model, where the constitution demands that they are given resources so that they can provide resources without discrimination. Has that changed the country? A tremendous amount of change has taken place in this country as a result of devolution. There is no local place you'll go to and meet services being delivered in the same manner as they were being delivered 15 years ago. Access to health services has improved in a number of areas. If you think about opening rural roads, if you think about pre-primary education, there are some places which never had a functional hospital before devolution. People would travel for long distances to come to go for medical care. But now devolution has changed all that, and we can say, yes, it's work in progress. A lot more needs to be done because also corruption is on increase in the new unit. Let me end up by talking about ethnicity and inequality. I have argued that ethnic inequalities are the result of governance, poor governance in our society. And it's simply because political elites using first past the post electoral system, in our case in Kenya now, build political parties along ethnic lines, and therefore compete for office along ethnic lines. I've seen in South Africa is also ethnicizing very fast. In fact, we thought it was racializing, but it's ethnicizing very fast.
It is.
Right? I've seen that even in Zimbabwe is ethnicizing very fast. And the reason for that is because electoral system of first past the post, except in South Africa, creates opportunities for politicians now to mobilize their communities as a place for getting, as a platform for getting into power. But once they get into power, they start advancing their self-interest. And that creates patronage system. Political patronage now becomes the one which moves resources. And that leads to a lot of inequalities in the society and becomes a major challenge to governance as well.
Prof, I know we have scratched the surface. Your body of work is just illustrious. And I want to end probably by saying, I know that you are still going to be heavily involved in scholarship, in mentoring young people. You have just, stepped down from being the director of the institute. So what's next for Prof? And any advice for people who are getting into the long journey that you have traveled? For example, your successor Paul and others. What are the key lessons and key issues that you would say, having traveled this journey, and I know I'm going to this new phase of my life, but these are 2 or 3 things that I would say for anyone getting into this space of scholarship, leading institutions, mentoring young people. These are the 3 or so things that I would say, please keep the torch on.
1, establish international linkages. Establish international linkages and ensure that actually they are intercontinental, so that you know what is happening in every continent, and establish linkages that are good for younger people, for other researchers, and so on. The second thing to say is publish in high impact journals. And don't publish at my level, don't publish alone, publish with younger people so that you can mentor them as much as possible. Thirdly, do not put down your research work. Continue. Do not throw the towel. Continue with research. I'm actually continuing with research. I'm looking for fellowship opportunities where I can be going for 3 months, write something, publish something, go to another place, publish something. That's the life I want to lead now. Doing research and continue with research as much as possible. Prof, but those are the 3 things I would like to say are very important.
Prof,
and most important is also that ensure your students, ensure your students become part of those international linkages. Ensure your students are linked to international universities elsewhere and visit those universities as scholars as well.
Prof, I know that, like I said, we have just scratched the surface, and I took advantage of the fact that you are here. We have this platform to talk about these issues, but I would really love maybe to take on your next journey, the fellowship idea, for example, for us to really get deeper into, almost like writing your story in a way. I know you're an academic, you would want to research more and do other things, but I would be interested in just pulling these nuggets out of you, especially for the young people. And so that fellowship idea, I think we should find a way of making it work, whether at VETS or in any other institution. So that would be very, very useful for the young people as well.
I would be happy to do so.
Thank you so much, Prof.
I'm available. What I would like to do now is, as we have discussed is to train the PhDs and have a continental way of reaching out to PhDs and building their skills and competencies.
Thank you so much, Prof. I know I did not do a proper introduction, but I think to our audience, you have learned who Prof Karuti Kanyinga is. He is actually a research professor at the University of Nairobi, based at the Institute of Development Studies. For a long time, he was the director of the institute. He recently stepped down, but as you heard, he's going continuing with his research work on so many areas of interest, some of which we have discussed here. That was Prof. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.